Hello, in this video we are gonna be looking at spells in Lost Eidolons. I finished the game on hard difficulty, so I feel like I have enough knowledge to be able to tell which spells are good, which spells are maybe not so good. So we're gonna look at the spells in a moment, but let's look at something else first as a little introduction to how it all works in this game. So in this game we have three types of grimoires. So we have elemental, dark and light grimoires, and they divide spells into three categories. So we have elemental, dark and light spells. So elemental spells are mostly about damage. There is some CC there as well, but they are just mostly about dealing damage, and they are good on classes like a sorcerer, for example. Dark magic is a mixture of damage and crowd control, so there are some really strong crowd control dark magic spells that I'm gonna recommend later on. And then light magic is just healing, it's just for healers. So healing spells and spells that help you protect your allies in one way or another. So that's one important thing. The second important thing is that if we go here and look at this thing. Okay, so in this game there's this thing called drenched status effect. So you can see when a drenched unit is targeted by an ability with fire effects, damage is reduced by 20% and the drenched status is cleared. When attacking a drenched unit with lightning effects, damage is increased by 20%, and if a drenched unit is hit with ice effects, they will become frozen. So in many encounters in this game, you will have different sources of water, and there is a way for your heroes to also make the terrain wet, and enemies, when they stand on that wet terrain, they will become drenched. So this is a status effect that you will see pretty much all the time. So because of that, I am gonna really recommend using lightning and cold spells to get that bonus damage, or to get that CC to freeze your enemies. Whereas fire spells against drenched enemies, as you can see, they deal reduced damage. So yeah, so that was just a quick introduction. Also, I'm recording this. So far, I don't think there has been any major balance changes or patches. So this is how the game. I mean, there have been some bug fixes, but nothing major in terms of like spell balancing. So if anything changes, I'm just gonna probably add a comment to this video, or maybe do like an update video. We'll see. All right, so after that introduction, let's look at the actual spells. We're gonna start with I've got a level 50 sorcerer here, so we're looking at one of these elemental grimoires. So some of these books will have imprinted spells like this one here. So if you get any grimoires with imprinted spells, I definitely recommend that you use them, because essentially it just gives you free spells during your encounters, which, especially at higher difficulty, towards the end of the encounter, it can get a bit tight. You may kind of be running out of spells if you use too many spells too early on minor enemies and not keep them for like bosses later on. You may be in a situation where you're gonna be short on spells, and then your caster's just gonna be standing there doing nothing. We're gonna start from top to bottom. So Fireball is the first one we're gonna look at, and it's Fireball and Pillar of Fire are both early game spells. So Fireball, as you can see, has a power of 2, uses per battle 5, and a range. If you look at that diagram there with red squares, that's the range from the caster. So this is an early game spell that you shouldn't use for too long. because of that drenched status effect that I explained. So most of the time enemies will be drenched, or there'll be a way to make them wet, so Fireball will be actually doing less damage. So for early game it's a good spell, but later on you don't really want to use it too much. Then we have Pillar of Fire, and it's the same situation. The difference between Fireball and Pillar of Fire is that Pillar of Fire has a power of 3, and as you can see the range is higher, so you can it's now 3 tiles instead of 2. But the trade-off here is that it only has 3 uses per battle. Pillar of Fire and Fireball are, don't get me wrong, they are good damage dealing spells, but because of that range status effect, you kind of want to use some other spells later on. Then we have Firestorm. This one you will get later in the game. You can see the required mastery there is 10, whereas Pillar of Fire is 1 and Fireball is 1 and Pillar of Fire is 3. So this is a spell that you're going to be getting later in the game. And this is an AoE, calls down an Inferno, inflicting fire damage on an enemy, as well as half damage to other enemies in a 3x3 area. This can be counterattacked. I personally am not a big fan of this spell, because it only has a power of 2 with 1 use per battle. Only your target will get full damage, but surrounding enemies will just get half the damage. And again, it's a fire spell, so it has the same problem as the other 2 that I just explained. With only 1 use per battle, this late in the game, there are actually better options. During your turn, you really want to kill as many enemies as possible. So killing 1 enemy with just 1 hit is definitely better than doing an AoE that takes 20% of 20% health of multiple enemies. It's just not worth. Then we have Cyclone. So this is actually quite interesting. So this one, as you can see, has a power of 3, but only 2 uses per battle. However, the range is even greater, because now you're looking at 4 tiles. From my experience, a range of 3 was, for most encounters, it was the perfect range. 2 was sometimes too close, but 3 was perfect. So I don't think, although casters have probably, I think they do have the lowest mobility in the game, so sometimes you will find yourself out of range. And I had a few encounters where my casters were left behind. So not every encounter in this game is static. Sometimes you have to move your party constantly, and if some of the casters are left behind, then they can't fully participate, which gave me some problems. So there is an argument for that range of 4, but because it's not a lightning spell, or not a cold spell, which gives you that boost against ranged enemies, I don't think it's worth. Also, 2 uses per battle is really bad, so for that reason I wouldn't necessarily recommend using this spell. Then we have Tempest Gust. It has a power of 1, which is already extremely bad, because like I said, you want to get rid of an enemy with 2 hits, and with a power of 1 you're not gonna be able to do it. 4 uses per battle and a range of 3, but yeah, it's a mastery level 1 spell, so it's something that you use early game and then you never use it again. Okay, now we're moving to spells that I actually use because they are good. So the first one is Thunderbolt. So this is a carbon copy of Fireball with 2 power, 5 uses per battle, the same range, but it's a lightning spell. And like I said, because of the drench status, because of how many enemies will be, how many encounters will have enemies with drench status, you're gonna be dealing 20% extra damage fairly often. So that's why I think Thunderbolt is better than Fireball. There was one encounter from my memory where with an enemy that was actually vulnerable to fire magic. This was probably the only encounter where Fireball was better than Thunderbolt, but most of the time you really want to use Thunderbolt. Storm Strike, the same logic applies. It's like Pillar of Fire, it deals lightning damage, and lightning damage is good. It's also worth mentioning, if enemies are standing on adjacent tiles and you use a lightning spell and they're all drenched, they will take AoE damage. So not only you will be dealing 20% more damage to your main target, you'll also be dealing some extra AoE damage to adjacent enemies. It's not a lot, but it's something. Sometimes that extra damage can become very handy later on. All right, moving into hydro spells. There's something that I need to add here, and to fire spells that I forgot to mention. So with hydro spells, they leave a puddle or wet terrain after you cast them. So any enemies that stand on a tile with wet terrain become drenched. So then you can combo these spells with lightning or cold spells to either deal more damage with lightning spells or to freeze enemies with cold spells. And fire spells, if you use them on tiles that have woods, so like bushes or trees, they set them ablaze, and any character on a tile that's on fire will take fire damage for standing on that tile. So that's also worth mentioning. And then you can use a water spell to put that fire down if you want to. Okay, so then we go to Hydro Bomb. Also 5 uses per battle, 1 power, range of 2. Overall, not recommended because of that low power. Even though you can met wet terrain with this spell, the power of 1 is just really bad. Then we have Hydro Clone. So here we have power of 2, 3 uses per battle, but a range of 3. So sometimes I would use this spell to then combo it with a cold or lightning spell. So that's the reason why I have it in use. Then you have Torrential Rain. So this is very similar to Firestorm because it has a power of 2, 1 use per battle. I think it's the same. Actually Firestorm has better range, as you can see. So Firestorm does have better range. This is a bit more restricted when it comes to its range, but I think the damage is the same. So it inflicts water damage on one enemy and half damage to other enemies in a 3x3 area. This spell will leave, if you look at the area of effect, you are looking at 9 tiles that are now considered wet terrain. So then you can use Thunderbolt or Storm Strike and start dealing increased lightning damage, or you can use something like Cold Wave or Blizzard to freeze enemies. So unlike Firestorm, this gives you increased damage with your lightning spells, or CC possibility with your cold spells. So it's something that you should definitely consider using. Then we have Cold Wave. So this spell is like Pillar of Fire with 3 power, 3 uses per battle, same range, but it deals cold damage, and it deals ice damage. That's how it's called in this game. And ice damage, again, on a wet target, that target is frozen. That means that it will skip its turn. Then we have Ice Wall. So this is a CC spell. Summons an ice wall up to 3 tiles. The wall can only be summoned on empty tiles, lasts for 1 turn, on flatlands and rugged terrain, and breaks when attacked. I think I only used this once and I didn't really like it. The job of your sorcerers and elemental magic users is most of the time to just deal damage. I don't think it's a very good spell. I mean, using Cold Wave on wet enemies is just much better than trying to stop them with Ice Wall. So overall, I'm not a big fan of this spell. Then we have Blizzard. You can see the required mastery is 15. So this is another AoE spell, this time for cold magic. But the difference here is if your enemies are on wet terrain, they are all gonna be frozen. So not only it will deal a lot of damage, but it will also CC any drenched enemies on those 9 tiles that it's hitting. So this combined with this is deadly for groups of enemies. It's really, really good. Obviously only 1 use per battle. Most of the time you will be facing masses of enemies, so it will be good. There are a few encounters where enemies come in smaller waves, so for those encounters you probably don't want to use that, but most of the time it will be very useful, but you will be only getting it at the very late stages of the game because of that required mastery. And then we have Glacial Gale, which is another spell another basic spell with 2 power, 5 uses per battle, and it works like Cold Wave, but with less power and less range. From my experience, having Thunderbolt with 5 uses and then 2 spells with three uses, so like Storm Strike and Cold Wave, was enough for one encounter. But you may have a different playstyle, I don't know, so you need to kind of find the balance for yourself to be able to figure out what really is good for you. So this is how I run my mages late game. I use Storm Strike, Thunderbolt, Blizzard, Torrential Rain, and Cold Wave. You can, well, you're gonna get Blizzard very, very late, so before you get Blizzard, you can use Pillar of Fire, or you can use Hydroclone if you want wet terrain. Alright, now let's look at some examples of dark spells. So we're gonna start with Night Veil. Okay, so Night Veil may be the best spell in the game right now. It's just fantastic for almost every encounter. I think there are only maybe 1, 2, 3 encounters in the entire game where this spell will actually not be good. This spell made my gameplay or on hard difficulty so much easier. So let's actually see what it does. So it summons a dark fog on a 3x3 area surrounding the target tile. The fog lasts for 2 turns. While within the fog, units have -2 movement and lose 8 health each turn. You can use it twice per battle, which is crazy. Mastery level 10, so yes, you're gonna get it a bit later in the game, but not like at the very end of the game. So there will be many encounters when this spell will be available. So what's so good about this spell? Well, number one, those enemies who are gonna be trapped in the fog are gonna have their movement restricted, and they're gonna take 8 health, 8 damage each turn, and they will find it very difficult to actually get out. They will waste a lot of time trying to get out, and while trying to get out, they will take a lot of damage. And those enemies who are behind the fog will try to avoid it. Okay, so if possible, the AI will not step into the fog, but will try to go around it. But by doing this, because the area effect is very large, it's 9 tiles in total. So by doing this, the enemy will waste, the AI will waste a lot of time. And because in this game, enemies tend to come from different directions, sometimes by using Night Veil, you can block or significantly slow down enemies coming from those directions and just deal with one threat at a time. Also, there are battles in the game where you are, for example, defending a castle. You have to defend your position, or there is a very narrow road, passage, or whatever that the enemies have to go through to reach your heroes. It can devastate large groups of enemies and give you total control on the battlefield. If it doesn't get nerfed, I recommend even having 2 warlocks, so you have 4 uses of this spell, because it's just so good. Alright, next up we have Somnolence. So this is a crowd control spell, uses the power of darkness to put an enemy to sleep, granting the drowsy status effect for 1 turn. Attacking a drowsy enemy will cause this status to end. Spell can be counterattacked. This is a very good spell. You can see the range is pretty insane. So I think this spell with Expulsion, which is here, are very, very good spells. Why? Well, in this game, you generally have 2 types of enemies. You have normal minions, and you have like bosses, heroes. So these boss enemies, they take reduced damage for as long as one of these minor enemies are nearby. So in every encounter, you will always have to kill minions first before you can actually deal any significant damage to one of the bosses. If you don't do that, the bosses just take 1 damage. But very often it's very difficult, because when you clear the front lines, you still have to deal with archers and spellcasters which are behind. So that will give the enemy heroes that are melee, a lot of time to damage you before you can reach the back lines and start dealing with casters and archers. This spell is good because this allows you to put those strong enemies to sleep twice per battle, and it gives you time and it gives you space to deal with any minions first. So this spell is fantastic, and I highly recommend this one as well. Then we have Silence. An aura of darkness envelops the enemy, preventing the target from using magic for 1 turn. So this is kind of similar. The difference is that the range is even higher. It has 3 uses per battle, and I think that's it, really. It's essentially it's the same goal. You just want to prevent one enemy from taking action during their turn, but this will only work for magic users. But most of the time, you really want to CC those strong heroes. You don't want to waste those spells on like ordinary minions. And the enemy heroes are usually like melee or ranged, or they can cast spells but also use melee attacks. So it's not always a silence is not always gonna be enough to stop them. So it can be used on like spellcasters and it will be fine, but there will be a lot of encounters where it won't be able to do the full job like this spell. The idea is to crowd control, but I just don't think it's as powerful. Then we have Shroud Focus. Cast a shadow haze over one enemy, inflicting dark damage and decreasing their magic power by 10 for 1 turn. Not very good. Power of 1. Yes, you decrease magic damage, but again, that will only work on spellcasters, and if you want to deal with spellcasters, I mean, that range is probably not gonna be enough anyway. So I don't know, this spell is just not very good. I don't think I've ever used it actually. Then we have Debilitation. A shadow snare traps the enemy, inflicting dark damage and decreasing movement by 2 for next 2 turns. This is good early game, so this is gonna be your first form of crowd control. You can see the required mastery is 1. So yes, early game it's pretty good. 3 uses per battle. The range is bad, but you really want to, it's only good against melee characters anyway, because range characters, it doesn't, they don't need to move because they can attack you from range. But any enemy melee characters, -2 movement can actually prevent them from hitting some of your heroes. So yeah, early game pretty good. Late game you just replace it with better crowd control spells. Then you've got Putrefy. Inflicts dark damage on one enemy, lowering their physical defense by -5 for 1 turn. Not very good. In this game, like I explained earlier, your best choice is to always kill if you can. Okay, if you can kill an enemy, you always want to kill that enemy. If you can't kill the enemy, if you can't eliminate them, you just want to CC them, but you want to CC them to the point where they are completely unable to act. And this is not that. This is a bit of damage and lowering physical defense. Like, you're better off just doing the damage than lowering their physical defense. You see what I mean? Like, just do the damage. Like, why would you lower their physical defense if you can hit them with something like Leech Arrow, which has power of 3, or something like Dark Arrow, which has a power of 2, but 5 uses per battle. So I don't recommend this, only 2 uses per battle. That lowering physical defense will make no difference, so don't use this spell. Then we have Dark Burst. Causes an explosion of shadow, inflicting dark damage on one enemy. Adjacent enemies take half the damage and are pushed backwards by 1 tile. This cannot be counterattacked. Okay, 3 power, 2 uses per battle. This is okay. It's like a weaker version of AoE that elemental magic has the access to. So with these elemental magic AoE spells, you had 9 tiles that were affected, whereas here you're only looking at 5, but it has 2 uses per battle. I mean, most of the time, yes, it's a late game spell that's very, very good. So most of the time, late game, you probably want to have this. Funny enough, the very last encounter, enemies actually come in waves, in smaller waves. So it wasn't that good for that encounter, But most of the time it will be actually pretty good. So yeah, if you can use it, then use it. It's a very strong AoE spell. Then we have Dark Armor. An aura of darkness protects this unit for 2 turns. While under this effect, the unit receives minus 20% damage from physical attacks, and 25% of total damage is reflected back to the attacker. This spell is okay. I only use it a couple of times. Most of the time you just want to do the damage or CC. Right, then we have Dark Armor. An aura of darkness protects this unit for 2 turns. While under this effect, the unit receives minus 20% damage from physical attacks within 2 tiles, and 25% of total damage is reflected back at the attacker. Although this is a mastery level 10 spell, I don't actually think it's that good. Most of the time you just want to deal damage or CC. Also with your spellcasters, with your backline in general. So we're looking at all the spellcasters, the healers, the sorcerers, the warlocks, and some ranged units. You want to keep them protected. You don't want them to be in a situation when they start taking damage, especially like if they get focused down by melee characters supported with enemy minions with bows. That's gonna be very difficult for you if that happens. So you really just want to keep them in a safe spot. Most of the time, spells like that you won't have to use if you place your units in the correct areas on the battlefield anyway. Then we have Dark Arrow. So this is gonna be one of your first spells. Power 2, 5 uses per battle, very low range. I think for most of the game, except for early game, I did not use that spell, because my warlocks were mostly used for CC, so they would cast Night Veil, Somnolence, and Expulsion, and then just deal damage with Leech Arrow, which I'm gonna talk about in a moment. But I think in the very last encounter, I actually ran out of spells during my 2 or 3 tries that I failed. So if you're running out of spells, you can consider replacing one of the CC spells with Dark Arrow, because it deals decent damage and you have 5 uses per battle, so it's not a bad spell. Then we have Leech Arrow, so it's a better version because it has a power of 3, and also it heals the attacker for half the total damage. So this deals damage but also heals you, but only has 3 uses per battle. So this is the one that I use, which is better. It's more powerful, it heals you, and like I said, my warlocks were doing a lot of CC. I didn't expect them to deal that much damage. Then we have Dark Grasp. So this spell immobilizes the enemy. So this is pretty good early game. Again, this is another good early game spell. It can stop some melee characters from attacking your heroes. So early game, it's good, use it. Late game, just replace it with Somnolence or Expulsion. Then we have Shadow Burst. This is another good spell that I recommend. It has a power of 3, 3 uses per battle, but a range of 3. And most of the time, you don't want your warlocks to be too close, because with the CC spells, you can see that Expulsion and Somnolence, they actually have a pretty good range. So sometimes you'll find yourself pretty far away from enemies. So the range on this spell is perfect, and I definitely recommend using it as your second damage spell with Leech Arrow. And then we have Abyssal Whisper, sends forth a shadow aura, inflicting dark damage on one enemy. The power of the spell is increased by 5 if the enemy is mounted. So it's the same spell, but less damage, but more damage against mounted enemies. To be honest with you, I don't think it's that good. I mean, there are some encounters where you are dealing with mounted enemies, but I don't know. Most of the time, I don't think they are actually mounted, so I don't think it's necessary. Then we have Expulsion, the last one, which is probably the strongest single target CC spell. Expels an enemy. Expelled enemies do not benefit from effects such as healing. They can't be targeted by physical or magic attacks. So this spell eliminates an enemy completely. There's nothing that can be done about it. The enemy is just gone for 1 turn. So this is the strongest CC spell with, as you can see, a pretty good range and 2 uses per battle. So I definitely recommend using this spell on your warlocks. So this is how a spell book looks like normally for my warlocks. You've got Leech Arrow, Shadow Burst, Night Veil, Somnolence, and Expulsion. And you can replace one of these CC spells. Don't replace Night Veil though, because it's really good. But you could use Dark Burst here instead of somnolence and keep expulsion. So I guess this would be my recommended setup for a warlock. Last but not least, we have the healing spells, the light grimoires. So let's have a look. We start with Healing Touch. So this is your basic healing spell with 5 power, 6 uses per battle, and a very limited range. Early game, you want to use it all the time pretty much. The danger of this spell is that healers are very squishy, and as you can see, this spell requires you to be fairly close to your ally who you're gonna heal, and most of the time it's your melee characters that gonna be taking the most damage. So this puts your healers kinda close to the front lines. So later on, you probably want to replace this spell with Healing Light, which is the same spell, but as you can see, Healing Light, the range is much higher. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tiles. So the range of Healing Light is much better with the same power, but it has 4 uses, so 2 less uses per battle. So that's the trade-off there. But for me personally, for most encounters, it was enough until I think maybe the last 1 or 2 encounters. So you should be fine using Healing Light later on, but early game you use Healing Touch because it's your most reliable healing spell. Then we have Sanctuary. This is a late game spell. Creates a sanctuary of radiant light surrounding the unit in a 3x3 area. For 2 turns, allies in the sanctuary receive minus 20% damage from physical attacks and gain plus 15 health at the start of the turn. Probably the best light spell in the game, definitely a must-have. So it's a heal for 2 turns, and also it reduces damage from physical attacks by 20%. Yeah, it's really good. It's late game, but once you get it, definitely use it. Then we've got Sacred Calling. So this is a very unique and interesting spell. So this is basically a teleport for an ally. So uses the power of light to move a distant ally to an adjacent tile. There are definitely a few encounters where this spell will be very handy. So it's probably not for every single battle, but some battles you may find this spell useful. So this is more of a situational spell. Then we have Purification. Channels the power of light to cleanse all status effects on a single ally, granting plus 10 health for each effect removed. I don't think I used this spell once, and the reason for that is because the status effects are not that bad in this game. Like, the negative status effects on your heroes are not really threatening. So most of the time you don't really care about cleansing anything because you just want to heal or deal damage. Then we have Hymn of Healing. This is a very good spell because it has a healing power of 15. So it's worth 3 healing touches basically, but only 3 uses per battle with a very limited range. Still, this is a spell that I used in almost every encounter. Later in the game, your heroes, especially like your melee tanky characters, they have a lot of health, and using Healing Touch or Healing Light heals like 1/4 or 1/3 of their health. So sometimes you need something bigger, something more powerful to heal them, and this is where Hymn of Healing is really good. So something that I used all the time pretty much. Then we have Holy Nova. Unleashes a radiant burst, inflicting light damage on a single enemy. I didn't use that spell a lot because of its low power. Yes, it has 3 uses per battle and a power of 2, which is why I found it to be problematic, because I really had trouble finishing off enemies with that. I used Radiant Arrow most of the time, so sometimes it's definitely more effective just to finish an enemy off and prevent them from attacking, because if you finish off an enemy, then they won't attack, so it's kind of like healing, because the enemy will not deal damage. But the problem with Holy Nova is that power of 2 is really not strong enough to deal any significant damage. So you're better off using Radiant Arrow, which is the damage spell that I used, because it has a power of 3. I would definitely recommend using at least 1 damaging spell on your healers, and that spell, in my opinion, should be Radiant Arrow, just to ensure that kill. Healing Light we've already spoke about. Already mentioned that. Divine Hand protects an ally within an aura of light, decreasing magic damage by 30% for the next 2 turns. Not very good. Only 30% increase, only from magic damage. 4 uses per battle. I mean, I don't know what they were thinking when they made this spell, but it's just really weak. I've never used it. It's just not good. Divine Protection envelops an ally in an aura of light, granting the Divine Protection status for 2 turns. While under this effect, attacking an enemy will provoke them, reducing their accuracy by 10 and forcing them to prioritize their attacker next turn. Okay, so I think I used this spell maybe 2 or 3 times. I just don't think it's really good because it just involves too many actions to actually be good. You have to cast this and then you have to use your other hero to attack an enemy. Then you have to kind of get benefit from provoking them and reducing their accuracy, which is not always the case because for most of the time you just want to kill enemies. You don't want to provoke them. You want to provoke some of the stronger enemies, fair enough, like bosses and enemies that are really hard to kill. Sometimes you need to provoke them. Provoke is taunt in this game, by the way, so sometimes you want to have them taunted so they attack your tanks, but those tanks, they have their own skills to provoke, so they don't need to have this spell on them. So I don't know, for me this spell is a waste of a slot. Then we have Blessing. Channels the power of light to cleanse all status effects on multiple adjacent allies, granting +5 health for each effect removed. So this is the cleanse debuff remover that I used because it targets multiple allies and also heals them a bit with 3 uses per battle. So I think this one is actually worth having. There were some encounters where like 3 of my characters were frozen and they were next to each other or they were immobilized, and then I could cast this spell and just remove any forms of crowd control. So if you are thinking about running a cleansing debuff remover spell, just run this. Then we have Binding Heal. The good thing about this one is that it has a power of 10, 3 uses per battle, which is not that great, and the range is obnoxious. It's really bad. I personally never use this spell because most of the time I try to place my healers behind my tanks because of spells like Hymn of Healing and Healing Touch. If you use it, you have to be fairly close sometimes, so you will be close to the tanks, which will make you open to like bow attacks from enemies. So that range may not be that bad because you may be standing next to the tank and you may get like shot with a bow and an arrow, so you may want to heal yourself a bit as well. But generally, I don't know, I think most of the time I kept my healers within safe levels of health. There was never a situation where I need heals on both my healer and one of the melee characters, for example. So I personally never use this spell. Then we have Light Arrow. It's a damage spell. It has 5 uses, but the power of 1 is not gonna change anything, so I definitely recommend not using that. Radiant Arrow, like I explained, this is the damage spell that I used, so I recommend using that one for damage. And then Healing Wind is another must-have. So this is an AoE healing with a power of 10 that, as you can see, it works in that cross pattern. So you can heal up to 5 allies, 1 in the middle, 1 on the left, 1 on the right, 1 up and 1 down. It's fairly easy during some encounters. It's fairly easy to actually get your allies into that position. I mean, most of the time you will get at least 4 allies in the right position. As you can see in the range diagram, you actually can't cast it on yourself effectively. So it's only for your allies. You can't just put yourself in the middle and cast it around you. But yeah, it's a great spell. The power of 10 is amazing. 2 uses per battle. It really is great. So as soon as you have that spell, start using it. So for my healers, this is what I normally use. We have Healing Light and Hymn of Healing as the 2 healing spells. Then I have Blessing for debuff, Radiant Arrow as my damage spell, and Healing Wind. And later in the game, you may replace Blessing with with Sanctuary, for example. So, and if you feel like you're running out of healing spells and you still need healing spells, then I guess you just replace Radiant Arrow with Healing Touch, and this way you have, well, you have all the heals really. Everything is you're sorted in terms of healing. I personally never had, maybe until the very last battle, I didn't have that problem, so I could just use one slot for a damage spell. So yeah, this is kind of the late game composition that I recommend when it comes to healing spells.